Hello, this is Will Faerber from Art to Ride, and today we're looking at the first submission by Tine of her horse Hallmar. Hallmar is a 10-year-old Icelandic. She's had him for about 4 years now, working with him, and has just begun doing Art to Ride. It sounds like a few months back, and they're trying to incorporate this into the work that she's doing. With some success, I would say. So what I see here is quite good as it goes on. We'll talk about it, but you do get this horse to quite a good place as it goes on here. So I think you're pretty much on the right track here. One of the biggest things that I see, however, in the work in hand work is just to try to get him deeper in the work in hand. The actual riding part of this is actually better than the work in hand part in terms of where you're getting him to. So just know that this first work on the ground, that we really want to get him stretching deep in the work in hand. That's what it's for before we get on, so they already know how to do that. So just kind of bear that in mind. So we'd still like to see the walk becoming a little more active, which it does, and it goes on and starts to stretch. But I'm saying that should be our goal in trying to keep it there for quite a bit longer. I applaud your idea about how long to work a horse. She says she never works them over about 35 minutes, and I think that's about right. 35 minutes, 45 minutes is at the hour tops is the longest any horse should ever be worked. You don't really gain anything by doing things over and over and over again, wearing horses out. That's the first thing to realize, that too much work is what ruins so many horses, that their legs can only stand so much, and they can't really tell you what's going on, all their aches and pains, and people just tend to keep going and going. So that's really about it. 35 minutes, 45 minutes, about there is about the right length of time for any horse working, unless you're, doing endurance kind of conditioning kind of thing where you're staying out for a longer period of time. But for most of them, that is about right. So here this walk is starting to look a little more active, and he's starting to have a little more active step. Looks quite cold there, and I applaud all of you for working your horses all year round in the snow and the rain and various other things. Unfortunately, so many people who ride dressage today would be scared to death to even ride in a ring like this with a little water on it, with a little wet. This idea that horses can only be ridden in $100,000 footing, which, if you're working horses in such a way that you're laming them up, that perfect footing is certainly important, but it's not going to solve your problems, as we see by so many dressage people that we meet today whose horses have all kinds of soundness issues most of the time because of the way they're going about calling what they do dressage. So once again, our goal should always be to get horses to last as long as possible and to be as pleasant as possible to ride. That's the basic idea here. So here she starts to get a little bit deeper, and that's always what I'm looking for. I'd like this horse to stretch all the way to the ground at this level. Now, seeing this horse in silhouette here, we can see this horse's belly is still a little dropped. He's not really coming up, pulling up through the abdominal wall very much, and there's a little bit of a drop in this horse's back. So you've got a ways to go here to get this horse in the kind of condition that you want to get it really working over its back. So that all comes together. As you see the back coming up and developing correctly, you'll see the belly being pulled up because it all works together. It's not like we only work the top line. That's kind of a bad way to think about it. We want to develop top line and bottom line. Just like in a person, if you ever studied Pilates, the idea is to balance your body on both sides. So your core is working, and that's exactly what we want a horse to do. In fact, I would say it would be relatively impossible to create top line and not create a bottom line as well that's correct. The step gets a little bit bigger here. But I think for this horse, once again, we have to look at the horse that we're working. This type of horse that's smaller and built a little stoutish as these horses are, they're rather interesting to work, because we just saw, I don't know if you saw the one that someone posted the other day. I'm not sure if that was an Icelandic or what that one was, but doing piaffe. And when you get these horses fit, they look very much like different horses. If you don't get them fit and you just ride them hollow in the back and they get big distended bellies, they look more like something that should be pulling a plow rather than being ridden. But oddly enough, even horses that pull plows should have top line and should be able to engage along their bottom line as well. That's how they pull correctly. That is, pull into a carriage or whatever they're pulling. You want to let the neck out and let the horse stretch into that, so that they push forward with their back end rather than just dragging themselves along in a cart by pulling with their front legs, which is they can do just like they can do when we ride them. but that's never a very good idea, whether they're cart horses or otherwise, in terms of getting them to last very longer. So once again here, I see you developing a little more activity here, but I want to see you encouraging him into a deeper stretch, which maybe you need to do a little more lateral work. So I'm not sure if that's an idea in your mind that you're not asking here, or you're just not quite getting it yet. Because once again, we always want to get the full length of the horse's neck. This was a question that came up recently on the associate trainers, that someone declared that because a horse's neck went out straight from the shoulders, that it didn't need to stretch as deep. Nothing could be further than the truth. Every horse, no matter how its neck is put on, needs to stretch the entire length of the neck. If we don't do that, then we don't get that action of the withers pulling up through the shoulders and really changing the top line and flattening out behind the withers, which is what we want to happen. When I talk about a horse lifting its back, a lot of people have the idea that we're talking about the lower back. Well, yes, we want the lower back to lift up, and that will fill in. But we want that upper back is where it must, as the withers pull up and through the shoulders and come forward, then the horse flattens out right behind the withers and gives you this lovely lifted spot to set on if your saddle fits correctly and allows you to actually sit in that place. So just some things to think about. So it's just like the old thing that people used to talk about, well, we want to do work to build up the horse's hindquarters. We want to build up the whole top line, not just the hindquarters. We see all these, now this is where I want you to get to here. So that's getting really good. And once you get there, then you just work for a little more swing at a time. But of course, once again, relative to the horse that we have, this is not a big 17-hand warm blood with, hocks that flex no matter what we do, the way some of them are bred these days. And that, of course, is what's given some people a very false impression of dressage, because we bred horses these days, these expensive ones, that seem to keep moving their hocks even when they're hollow in their backs, but they're really not. It's just they have more natural movement in it. But the interesting thing is the more natural movement they have, the hollower, when a horse is hollow, it actually destroys the horse even faster than if the horse didn't have good conformation. Because that conformation allows their muscles to work very well and therefore sometimes overstress things. So that stretch point when you had them before, that's really what we're looking for, and get in there, and we want that to stay there and stay there long enough till that really starts to flatten out. Once again, as we see this horse in silhouette, we can see there's a little drop to the horse's back there. We can see the belly is still a little bit distended out, both downwards and to each side. So the horse hasn't really pulled its core up yet. And that stays like that pretty much throughout this. So you've got some core work to do with this horse to get him strong enough, and just know that this is going to take more time than just a couple of months. It generally takes a couple of years of correct work to bring a horse to the level that the changes have happened in its body that allow it to collect. That is, the withers have come up through the shoulders. That area we sit on has become flatter. So those are the things we want to look for. So when we had that really deep stretch there in the working hand was what you're looking for. And we want to be able to get that quickly and be able to maintain that for most of the session that we're working the horse in order to get the most good that we're going to get. So as I'm saying here, once you get on, the stretch is absolutely a little better and a little more consistent than it was in the working hand. And once again, the only reason to do working hand is to teach the horse that seeking contact. That's why we do it. And of course, to help the horse strengthen its back before we begin to put pressure on. And of course, it teaches the horse how to move away from the legs and all those things that we need. So what we're seeing here is a really good stretch. And notice that when it gets down there, even though the horse isn't moving very fast, and you can see this is the kind of horse, as all these horses are, Legolas is the same way, who's not, does not have a lot of flexion in the hocks. It's fairly straight behind, if you will. That's how these horses are kind of built. The only way to get them to move their hocks correctly is to get them to stretch all the way down. And you'll see, as we saw there when you got on, all of a sudden we saw much more lifting to that hock and more flexion than we saw even in the working hand. So I don't know if it's just that it's easier for you to do the work when you're on top of the horse, or it's just thinking in the right way about what you're doing in the working hand. So just know that work in the hand goal is to get him down there and keep him there throughout the working hand like he is now, only now we just need to get a little more active. But get them to stretch first, and then gradually we make that activity. If we try to make too much activity at first, the activity itself can, and if the horse can't deal with it in its own weight, then the horse will tend to just fall on the forehand and hollow its back at the same time. So we can have a horse too active behind in the beginning. So we want to build that activity behind as we get the horse working over its back, instead of thinking, oh, if I just get it more active, it's going to get over its back. Now, sometimes there are very dull horses that we do have to activate a little more to get them working correctly. But even those, once we do, then we want to slow the horse right back down. And once again, we're always looking for the biggest step, or the biggest, whether it's a trot or a canter or whatever it is, in that sort of normal frame with the horse working over its back in as slow as possible rhythm. In other words, the deepest step with the slowest possible rhythm. So that's always a fine line that we walk, like you are doing here. But most of this is looking quite good, and your position in the saddle looks good. Your legs are nicely hanging underneath you. We'd like to see that. Once again, what most people don't realize is that so much of their position in the saddle is dependent on what they're riding in. If you ride in a saddle that sits you in a chair seat, well, that's what it's going to do, and you're not going to be able to get your legs underneath you without fighting or trying to put pads under the back of the saddle, of all the things we see people trying to do to compensate for saddles that don't actually fit them or their horses. So good stretch here, and once we get to that place, that's where you want to get to, and then just gradually ask for a little bit more movement. But that's where we want to get them to, all the way down there. You see how these horses change. Once again, do this. And the good news is it doesn't matter that this horse is already 10 years old. It never finished the growth cycle. It will finish it by doing the correct work. That is, the withers will come up through the shoulders. And when you get this work going really consistently in a year or so, you'll see a huge change in the horse's body. This horse will start to look like an athlete instead of like a little pony that might be taking somebody for a little trot ride, so to speak. It's amazing how good these horses can look. Like all of them, like all horses when they're trained correctly. And once again, that's what's fooled so many people about what's happening in dressage. Just because you pay $1 million for a horse, it's going to move phenomenally. People are fooled by all that movement. But you always have to ask yourself, how long did the horse last? And that's what I tell people all the time. Whoever you think is these great riders, if they're burning out horses every 2 years and buying a new one, or even 4 years or 5 years, horses should last 20 years. 25 years ago, the average age of the horse at Grand Prix at the Olympic Games was 15 to 16 years old. Now it's like 9 years old. And of course, most of those horses, as you see, that's why you don't see them come back to the next Olympics, because they burnt the horse out and the horse is finished. And especially if you do joint injections. Once again, just trying to keep warning people about these so-called joint injections that veterinarians have tried to convince people are a cure. They are not a cure at all. They're just a good way for veterinarians to make their house payment. They're very expensive. Takes them only seconds to do. But they will completely destroy your horse's legs if you keep doing it. The idea of maintenance injections is probably the most idiotic thing you could possibly do to your horse. There would be no quicker way to ruin your horse for life than to, every 6 months have the horse injected in every joint in its body. So something to keep thinking about. None of our horses are injected, just so you guys know. And you see all these 20-year-olds, Contigo now is 25 years old. These horses all go perfectly well without any injections. So now the one thing I would say here with what you're doing is just to begin to change it up a little more, changing direction a little more, riding some circles that are appropriate for the horse at this level. I would think about a 20-meter circle would be about it. So we want to keep changing it up, but all within the relative to what the horse can do in the correct frame. And this horse's correct frame is stretched almost all the way to the ground on this particular day, and will be for a little bit of while. So you see when that neck comes to right there, you can see how the bottom of the neck kind of thickens up. And while he's still stepping pretty actively, it kind of has a feeling like it's starting to go backwards a little bit, like the brake is coming on. And as he gets down, then we see much more of a sense of the horse swinging more actively forward without that sort of hesitation that he had for a moment there as the head came up into a position that wasn't very comfortable for him. So once again, as it goes down, so as you get that stretch all the way down, just trying to maintain that activity. The good news about the walk, though, it's a wonderful thing for people and horses because it's hard to do too much damage in the walk. So if you can really take your time and spend a lot of time trying to work out your rider problems as well as the horses. There's just really never any point in going on to the trot if you haven't solved the problems of the walk, and that's what, once again, begins the downward spiral with horses with their soundness. Because if the walk if you do the walk right and then go to the trot and just trot the horse for a half an hour upside down, well, you're wearing out the legs in the process. So we want as much as possible for every step to be right. So if that means doing nothing but walk with a horse for 6 months, if that's what you need to do, now that would be a very rare thing that a horse would need that, but I'm just saying it's better to do that. I don't want to take any steps with my horse upside down. That's the point of starting in the walk, getting the walk right. Then we go to the trot. We get the trot right. Then we go to the canter. The faster you go, the harder it is for the horse to deal with it all. And of course, the more wear and tear on the horse's legs. The faster it goes, the harder the concussion is in the horse's joints. So we want to have, that's why we don't want to work horses in just, for instance, watching people wear horses out on lunge lines, lunging them for 45 minutes, letting them jump around like lunatics and run. All that does is destroy the horse. That's when we have to realize that, most people are sort of slowly destroying their horses, and not even that slowly when we see what a short period of time most horses last these days in terms of when you look at the potential of a horse every horse should give you 20 good years. And if they don't, there was probably something wrong with the horse to begin with, like congenital something or other, or you simply, in more cases, just didn't do it right and you did too much too soon. That walk is starting to swing quite nicely there, and he's not too high in the head. I'd like to see a little deeper in keeping that activity, but that's better than when I pointed out before when the head came too high and all of a sudden the horse just kind of looked stiff in the underside of its neck. And while it was fairly active, it wasn't really moving over its back the way we'd like it to do. So once again, activity is not the same thing as working over the back. Horses can be very active, as we know, and not be over their backs at all. As we see, most dressage horses today are very active with their legs being thrown out straight from the shoulders. Their necks are braced against their own bodies, which is how you get a horse to throw its shoulder out like that. If you don't know that, that's how you achieve those terrible lengthenings of stride or extended trots where the horse is putting its legs straight out from the shoulder like a Spanish trot. If the horse doesn't come through behind, folks, to the same degree as the front in the extended trot, you are destroying the horse in the process of what you're doing, and you're basically over-flexing all the horse's tendons in the front legs and back legs, because the back legs are having to take more into the hocks as well, because the horse is no longer balanced. It's throwing itself into the movement in a position that the back drops, so you overextend all the tendons. So this walk is getting quite nice here. Notice how you're kind of in a mid-frame here, but at the same time the horse hasn't come too high, and you've kept a nice soft walk over the horse's back. So that's what I like to see, and then of course stretching down from that, as opposed to the one I pointed out before where the horse's head and neck got too high. So that's what we have to realize, that every horse has a level with the head and neck, that if you come too high with the head and neck, it will drop its back, and that's just as simple as that. It happens with every horse in the world. So if you try to force the horse into an unnatural position in its neck, it's only going to have bad repercussions in the back and the rest of the horse. Like a horse like this is never going to have a really high head and neck set because it's not built that way. This horse, like many's, like thoroughbreds and quarter horses, and many of these breeds that aren't bred with a big, giant, sloping shoulder with a neck that comes more straight upwards out of the body, those horses will have a higher head set when they flex correctly than a horse like this. But note that also, once we get the horse to lower behind, then the horse's head and neck will look like it's further up in the air, if you will. Look at some of the pictures of Perhaps in her heyday when she was schooling at the upper levels, and see how she's always flexed correctly at the pole, never back in the neck, yet her neck looks quite high because she's lowering behind. So once again, that's what brings the head and neck up, or the picture of it is more the lowering behind than the other way around. So good walk here. That's actually pretty nice working walk. She's staying once again as like it was before. You got a good active step and coming back to the stretch. So that's always what we do. We come up, we see if we can maintain that working walk, which you had for a few moments there. And then when we feel like the horse gets exhausted, we have to just go back and let it relax again. So a good start off here in the trot. I like how you didn't try to make any big demands or hold the horse in the frame. And that's a pretty good trot there. It's starting to swing through. And look how nicely the back end is underneath the body. And as you'll notice as the horse stretches down, once again, always watch the hocks when the horse stretches. Look how much more flexion there is in the hock when the horse stretches the whole length of the neck. The hocks are where everything comes from. The propulsion that lifts the front end of the horse off the ground can only happen if the back is round and we have developed enough push off those back legs that it pushes up into that round back and lifts the front end. That's what lightness is. You cannot pull a horse into lightness, as so many people would like to believe today. It's just hilarious. All you end up doing is holding the horse in your hands. That's not lightness at all. If they become light, it's only because they break over in their neck, so now the horse has no real contact, and people often think that's lightness. That's not lightness at all. That's the horse that's behind the bit and really taking no real contact, evading the contact because you've broken the horse in the neck. Not that you're doing that, you're not at all, and this is exactly how it should be. So good work here, and once again, I love, this footing is perfectly fine. Now, I grew up, I never had a ring growing up at our home farm. We just had big fields that we rode in, so that we kept clipped, that we could work horses in. The only time we ever rode in rings was when we went to horse shows. And same thing when I grew up and when I worked in the hunt country. The people I worked for, and many of the hunt people, did not believe in working in riding arenas. We always schooled out on the trails. Of course, this was in Unionville, Pennsylvania, where we had, wonderful trails and an entire county, huge county, all set up for fox hunting with fences that are set 50 feet off the roads and jumping panels every 100 yards and this kind of thing. So we had lots of places to work them. But once again, this idea that horses must only be worked on perfect footing, I mean, it's great to have good footing, but once again, that's the point of getting horses working correctly over the backs, is we don't have to have perfect footing. Our horses can skip over a little bump in the road, so to speak, because they're balanced on all four legs, which again has nothing to do with how high the horse's head and neck is. People today think that collection is pulling the horse's head up. Now, that was really quite a nice bit of trot work there, and I like how you came back. You didn't try to hold the horse in the frame. You made a nice, soft, appropriate transition back to the walk and let the horse stretch back out, and I love the walk when you get there. So once again, be sure and go back and look at those places where I pointed out in that trot how much more flexion there was in the horse's hocks when you got the stretch all the way down, the way you have it right there. And the horse really uses its hocks, and that's what we want to do, and leave it there and let that build, and only slowly, keeping that same movement, do we then bring the pole up when we can maintain that same movement. So if we bring the pole up and the horse just straightens its back legs and we no longer have that big step that we had, then it isn't very good. Now that's pretty good there, though. You're getting to a pretty good working trot right there where the horse has come up a little bit. It's not all the way in the stretch, but it's staying pretty nice, though not quite the flexion. Now, if you saw around that corner, the hind end's starting to go out the back a little bit. It doesn't have quite that underneath look that it had, and is beginning to tighten there a little bit underneath. So we need to get back into the stretch, which is hopefully what you're doing there. There, now it starts to look a little better. So once again, keep studying how the horse moves. All these people that say all these things like, oh, you should never stretch a horse below the knees. Well, watch the back end of the horse. See what it does when you actually do. And you get the horse to that place where we can really free that movement in the hocks. And once again, that's so important with these kinds of horses. With every horse, really. But once again, I say people get by today on these very expensive dressage horses that have a lot of movement in their hocks, but they're completely hollow. If they are, they're not doing dressage, by the way. And just so everyone knows, we're working on the World Dressage Federation. I'm just about to complete the first series of tests. So the next couple of days I'll have that all worked out, and we'll begin to launch everything in the first of the year here. So looking forward to that. Whole new judging system that I've come up with for judging dressage, the scoring system, which I think will make it much clearer for people, understand what they're doing. That came back to a good walk there. Got a little bit slow right there, but really nice. But you got a good stretch out of them. So I think you're right on track here. You've done a very good job. As I said, try to encourage a few more, adding into a little more leg yields into your work, both in the walk and the trot work, beginning to try that from the center line. But you're having a good effect. This stretch that you're getting here is really good. This is what we want to do. So once you can achieve that stretch all the way there, then just give yourself some time and follow the horse. Once again, if you try to bring the pole up and the horse just stiffens behind, and you don't, and you lose all that nice flexion in the hock that you had, and that sense of the horse pushing up into you, then you have to go back and let the neck stretch back down. No horses can hold those upper level movements forever, and that's the other kind of idea that people in dressage have gotten to, this idea that horses can just come out and be forced into these phony frames and be held there, for an hour and 2 hours at a time as they beat them through their so-called schooling. It should take no more, beating, if you will, to school any horse at a correct level than you've done here today. It takes very little to touch a horse if you're working it correctly. If you're trying to force it to do things, that's a whole other story. Not to say that they can't once in a while, be a horse that needs a little strong lesson, as Mr. Oliveira used to say, but that's never something that lasts for longer than a second, and never done in anger. If you're angry at your horse, get off and put the horse away, because you've lost the whole sense of what it is to be a horseman. So great work here today. I really enjoyed this. I think you're well on track. and look forward to your next one. So just adding some lateral work into what you're doing, keeping the stretch a little deeper and a little more consistent, especially in that work in hand. But really good work here. I see a lot of good work, and I look forward to seeing you again, and hopefully I'll see you next year somewhere along the way. Great job. This is Will Faerber from Art to Ride.